This video contains spoilers for Act 1 and 2 of Silksong. The Shell Shard is a core resource in Hollow Knight Silksong. It drops from enemies, is found in deposits, and can be bought from vendors. Although large amounts are at times required to fulfill certain wishes, the primary use of shards is to craft expendable red tools for combat. This system has sparked some amount of controversy in the wake of Silksong's release, and I think it's time to finally ask the question: are shell shards a problem? And if so, how do you fix them? I'm Holland, and this is a Silksong analysis. From my experience, there have been three primary criticisms levied against the shard system. 1. It's too grindy. 2. It punishes repeat attempts against bosses and enemy gauntlets. And 3. It makes the Architect crest impossible to balance. Let me address each criticism individually. The first argument is the shortest in formulation and, as expected, the least nuanced. To steelman the argument that shell shards encourage vast amounts of grinding, it is true that if you're not careful about your expenditure of red tools, you will have to go out of your way to grind for more. That creates a queer dynamic in the player's mind, mostly during boss fights and gauntlets. Do you give it your all, using every resource at your disposal, or do you temper yourself and risk losing the fight because you didn't feel like grinding shards for the third time today? This is, I believe, a fundamental problem with the system, that it's unclear whether you're supposed to exhaust your supply of tools on every attempt or use them sparingly even when they're most needed. For better or worse, in the original Hollow Knight, you never had a reason not to give every fight your all. In Silksong, and now you do. Mind you, red tools already provide an incentive for you to use them sparingly during combat, as your supply is ultimately limited per encounter. Red tools could have been defined as spells with no cost but limited supply. Instead, by imposing a steep secondary cost in terms of shell shards, the game makes you feel guilty about using red tools, while at the same time perversely compensating you by making each tool more powerful than was probably warranted. I always feel like I'm cheating when I use red tools, and I don't like that. When relying on this powerful crutch, you're liable to feel bad in two ways. One, because you're spending precious resources, and two, because you're essentially cheesing the boss. I think there's a lot of merit to the idea that being conservative with your use of red tools is in conflict with the game's desire to constantly be pushing your capabilities to the limit. In other words, having to worry about your shard supply while in combat is not necessarily a benefit to gameplay. Okay, so that is the steelman of the argument that the shard system is too grindy, one which I do find convincing, although not sufficiently nuanced. For example, I don't agree that all you need to do is simply increase the availability of shell shards. I think that's too simplistic a view. I also don't like the idea of just scrapping the entire system. For all I know, that may be the right answer, but it also seems like a bit of a cop-out. I want to see if it's possible to make shell shards work. Let's not be so quick to label that an impossibility. A more narrow criticism of the shard system is that it encourages grinding specifically in relation to boss arenas and enemy gauntlets. Succinctly put, the idea is that when you're already grinding a battle room, you shouldn't be forced to choose between either handicapping yourself or leaving to grind for shards someplace else before you can then return to grind the challenge at hand. For those who aren't aware, enemies that spawn in gauntlets do not drop shards or rosaries upon defeat. This means once you're out of tools, you're out for good, and more perniciously, you're liable to run out during those challenges you're struggling with the most. Some have argued that a portion of your tools spent in that arena should be refunded when breaking your cocoon. Mechanically, I think that's a reasonable suggestion, but it just seems to me slightly out of place aesthetically. That Hornet's cocoon would be able to store her spent tools, and only during gauntlets for some reason. So then you might ask, why don't arena enemies just drop shards? One argument is that this would allow you to gather too many resources by intentionally losing arenas and playing them over and over. I'd counter this contention simply by noting the obvious. Current methods for grinding shards and rosaries are already quite efficient, and they don't require you to die to reset them. Therefore, I'm inclined to believe this would not be an issue. The second, and to me more convincing argument, is that enemies dropping shards and rosaries would clutter up the screen, causing a visual distraction. This may or may not be true. I never heard people complain about it in the first game, but assuming that it is, you would have to decide which you valued more, better visibility or better tool balance. I tend to fall on the side of the latter. It doesn't entirely solve the problem of running out of tools against bosses, however a lot of bosses have gauntlets leading up to them, so it would still help. Finally, I'd like to bring up my main criticism of shell shards, which is surprisingly one that I've yet to hear many people talk about. And that's the problem of balancing the Architect crest. Consider for a moment a world where red tools did not cost shell shards. Now ask yourself the following. Would Architect be overpowered in that world? I imagine many of you would either say yes or it's already overpowered. And to me, that is a major issue. It's as simple as this. I'd like for every crest to be about equally balanced. And if one is clearly stronger than all the others, the fact that it requires mindless grinding to be effective is a very poor excuse for over-tuning it. I found that grasping this issue properly can be tricky, so let me attempt to summarize it. Here is the Architect problem. In its current state, the Architect crest will always be either the strongest crest in the game or needlessly grindy. This is why, if you balance it around the cost of shell shards, then as long as you're willing to grind, you should always be using this crest, as it's the only one you can really power up outside of combat, giving you a clear advantage. But if you balance it around the average power level of crests, then now you have to be willing to grind excessively just to be as powerful as everybody else. Now, of course, there are playstyle preferences to take into account, but as a general matter, I think this is a fundamental design issue, the Architect problem. So how would you go about fixing it? I would like to suggest 2 changes to the shard system that should help alleviate or solve each of the aforementioned issues. First, all enemies should drop the appropriate number of shell shards and all rosaries dictated by their specific enemy type. This change is made solely to relieve the need for grinding shards during gauntlet attempts. And second, shell shards should be made much more abundant, not during the early or mid game, but specifically in the late game. Hopefully you understand the rationale behind the first change, so let me take a moment to justify the second. See, I happen to think both sides of the discussion on shell shards are correct in some regard. I admire the resource management aspect of saving up and meticulously spending shards, but I also think this gimmick is at its peak early on and starts to lose its appeal towards the end of the game. To avoid any spoilers, I'll refrain from commenting directly on the very late game. However, I think it should be clear to those who've experienced it that the emphasis starts to shift away from exploring new areas and towards overcoming especially challenging enemy and boss encounters. At what point exactly the mid-game ends and the late game begins, I'm not at liberty to decide, but wherever you draw the line, I would suggest doing the following. Give the player 1 or more fun new options for obtaining shell shards, either in large quantities or passively over time, or reduce the cost of acquiring tools. To illustrate, here are a few examples. You might discover a location where you can set up a mining facility and pay an NPC to passively excavate shards for you. You'd have to return periodically to collect your payout. You might obtain, through purchase or otherwise, an item that sits in your inventory and passively generates shards. You might add a third upgrade type to your pouch, which reduces the cost of crafting red tools with 4 stages similar to the other upgrades. Or you might allow the player to reduce the cost of shard bundles in some way, and then grant him the ability to purchase multiple at a time. In fact, I would allow mass purchasing of shard bundles in any case as a simple quality of life change. One of these solutions, or a combination of multiple, would allow the player one final rich experience with regards to shell shards, being able to automate their production or in some other way make them less of a roadblock. By doing so, you draw a clear distinction between the resource-deprived early game, which will now feel especially novel on repeat playthroughs, and the resource-stable late game, where focus can be put more heavily on story or combat. You give the shard system a chance to shine while not forcing it to overstay its welcome. In my possibly naive outlook, this appears to be the best of both worlds. Not only does this partially or entirely solve the issue of shards feeling grindy, it also is a crucial step towards fixing the architect problem. By allowing shell shards to essentially be in unlimited supply during the endgame, you're no longer punished for wanting to use your red tools, and by extension, playing Architect. Now, to avoid the Architect crest instantly becoming the only valid meta pick, you would likely need to tweak how it functions. I don't mean to suggest it would need any radical changes, but let me not spoil what I have in mind. I hope to do a video series reworking every crest in the game, and when I cover the Architect crest, I'll explore how you could nerf it to compensate for the changes suggested in this video. If you'd like to see that series become a reality, let me know by subscribing to the channel. And if it's already been released by the time you watch this video, there'll be a link to it down below. My name is Holland, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.